June 18th, 1977, Tucson, Arizona. After disappearing from his family for 11 days, the body of escrow company owner Chuck Morgan is found outside his vehicle in the desert. He has been shot in the back of the head and is carrying a $2 bill which appears to have a coded message written on it. Even though Chuck is wearing a bulletproof vest and had allegedly survived a kidnapping ordeal 3 months earlier, the police rule his death to be a suicide. 13 years later, a Phoenix man named Doug Johnston is murdered, the apparent victim of a mistaken contract hit intended for a journalist investigating Chuck Morgan's death. After that, the trail went cold.
It is not a very normal place to shoot oneself as a suicide. And bear in mind, he's wearing a bulletproof vest at the time. I've never seen in all my years as a journalist a fellow take himself out in the desert wearing a bulletproof vest and shoot himself in the back of the head.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and that soundbite you just heard was from an Unsolved Mysteries interview with an investigative journalist named Don Devereaux, who is a prominent figure in today's story. Today, I will be profiling the unsolved deaths of Chuck Morgan and Doug Johnston, two cases which were featured on Unsolved Mysteries and happen to be connected together through Don Devereaux in a very frightening way. By the time you hear this, Chuck Morgan's case will have already been featured in a 2-part Halloween-themed article I co-wrote titled The Creepiest Unsolved Crimes No One Can Explain, which was published at crack.com just 2 weeks ago. The timing is good because I've actually had a few recent requests to cover this story, including from an emailer named Joel, and a poster from the Unsolved Mysteries board at the Sitcoms Online forum who goes by the username The Man in Black. So I think now is the perfect time to do an episode about this case, since I've been wanting to cover it ever since this podcast's inception. The death of Chuck Morgan is undoubtedly one of the most bizarre stories ever profiled on Unsolved Mysteries, and what's truly unique is that the case's inclusion on the show may have indirectly caused another unsolved mystery. Shortly after Unsolved Mysteries aired their segment about Morgan, another man named Doug Johnston was murdered, and in this episode I'm going to be discussing how these two cases might be linked. There isn't a lot of information available online about either of these stories, but there's some pretty crazy stuff here. So before we get started, let's get some business out of the way. The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast which alternates between our regular full-length episodes like this one and 15 to 20-minute minisodes about smaller-scale cold cases which don't have as much material. We deliver either a new full-length episode or minisode every Wednesday. We're currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play Music. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it. If you give us a rating or a review at any of these sites, you're opening the door for us to get more exposure and garner us some potential new listeners. The Trail Went Cold now has its own PayPal account and a new donate button on the website for anyone who's feeling generous. If there's anyone out there who feels like making a donation, we would greatly appreciate it, and we will happily provide any of our wonderful donors with a shout-out on a future episode. So with all that out of the way, let us now examine the mysterious deaths of Chuck Morgan and Doug Johnston. Our story begins in Tucson, Arizona in 1977. Our central figure is Charles Curtis Morgan, who goes by the name Chuck. Chuck seems to have a pretty ideal life, as he's a very successful businessman who has become president of his own escrow company in Tucson and lives with his wife Ruth and their 4 daughters. However, Chuck's life would take a turn for the bizarre on March 22nd of that year. After dropping off 2 of his daughters at school, Chuck was apparently on his way to work at his escrow company when he vanished without explanation. His family had no idea what happened to him until around 2 a.m. on March 25th, when Chuck suddenly came stumbling back into their house. He looked like he had been through a major ordeal, as his hands were bound with a set of plastic handcuffs, he had one plastic handcuff attached to one of his ankles, and he was missing a shoe. When Ruth asked her husband what happened, he did not say anything, as he simply pointed to his throat and implied he could not talk. Ruth asked Chuck if he could write, and he nodded yes, so she grabbed him a pen and paper, and he proceeded to write out a crazy story. According to Chuck, he had been kidnapped by people who painted his throat with an hallucinogenic drug, which could conceivably drive him insane or destroy his nervous system and kill him. Chuck had driven back to his house in his own car, but he wrote that he wanted Ruth to move the vehicle because he didn't want whoever kidnapped him to know he had returned home. Not surprisingly, Ruth wanted to get him some medical attention, but Chuck then wrote that if she told anyone about this, including the police, then their entire family would be killed. So, believe it or not, Ruth would have to spend the next several days nursing Chuck back to health herself inside their home. This drug apparently rendered Chuck unable to eat or drink properly, so Ruth was forced to feed him water with an eyedropper. At one point, Chuck wrote out the words, "My Treasury ID is missing," and hinted that he had secretly been working as an agent for the federal government for the past few years. Finally, after a week, Chuck regained the ability to speak, but he refused to tell Ruth any specific details about what actually happened to him. In fact, he just decided to go back to living his normal life again, though he became a lot more paranoid. Chuck started wearing a bulletproof vest every time he went out. He drove his daughters to and from school every day and told the school that no one else was to pick them up. On the morning of June 7th, Chuck showed up at his parents' house and told his father that if anything happened to him, there was a letter which would explain everything. Well, this alleged letter has never surfaced, and this turned out to be the last time anyone from Chuck's family ever spoke with him. 2.5 months after his last disappearance, Chuck just vanished without explanation again. 9 days passed, and Chuck's family never heard from him until Ruth suddenly received a phone call from an anonymous woman. She never identified herself, but she assured Ruth that Chuck was all right. This woman then decided to reference a Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8, before she hung up. So understandably, Ruth was quite baffled by this, but 2 days later, she received some tragic news. Chuck had been found dead. His body was discovered on the ground outside his vehicle in the middle of the Arizona desert, about 40 miles southwest of Tucson. He had been shot with his own .357 Magnum, and the gun was lying right next to him. Well, the Pima County Sheriff's Department ruled that Chuck's death was suicide, as there was gunshot residue found on his left hand. But as you heard in that sound clip from Don Devereaux at the beginning of the podcast, there were a lot of problems with this. Number 1, Chuck was wearing a bulletproof vest. 2, he was shot through the back of the head, which is a very unusual and difficult way to kill yourself. 3, even though gunshot residue was found on Chuck's left hand, he was right-handed. And 4, there were no prints whatsoever found on Chuck's gun. But there were so many other strange details about the crime scene. Chuck's car contained a cache of ammunition, guns, and CB radios, and it had undergone some modifications so that you could unlock the vehicle from the fender. A pair of sunglasses was found inside the car which apparently did not belong to Chuck. One of Chuck's teeth was discovered wrapped in a handkerchief in the back seat. There was a piece of paper with directions to the location written in Chuck's handwriting, which seemed to imply that he was planning to meet someone there. He was also carrying a concealed knife inside his belt buckle. But the weirdest detail had to be a $2 bill clipped inside Chuck's underwear. And guess what was written on there? Ecclesiastes. A 12 was written underneath that, and there were a set of arrows pointing to a 1 and an 8 in the bill's serial number. So this spelled out Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8, the very same Bible passage the anonymous woman quoted during her phone call to Ruth. But this was not the only thing written on the $2 bill. There was also a list of 7 Spanish surnames, starting with the letters A through G, and I apologize in advance if I'm not pronouncing these correctly. They were Acevedo, Bejarano, Quejero, Duarte, Encinas, Fuente, and Gradius. And that's not all. The back of American $2 bills all feature an artist's rendering of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and on Chuck's $2 bill, the individuals shown signing the Declaration were numbered 1 through 7. There also appeared to be a crudely drawn map of some roads located between Tucson and the Mexican border, and these led between 2 towns which were written out on the bill, Robles Junction and Salacity. There was also a ranch specifically identified near Salacity, and this location was known for having landing strips which were rumored to be used for smuggling between the U.S. and Mexico. So what we can deduce is that this $2 bill appeared to have directions and possibly some sort of coded message. So 2 days after Chuck was found, the Pima County Sheriff's Department received a phone call from a woman calling herself Green Eyes. She claimed she was the same anonymous woman who had phoned Ruth and quoted Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. Green Eyes claimed that she had met with Chuck at a motel several times after he disappeared, and the last time she saw him, he showed her a briefcase containing around $60,000 in cash. Chuck then said he was planning to use that money to buy himself out of a contract that the Mafia had put out on his life, but he did not provide any more details. If true, his plan obviously did not work, and the money was never found. And the story gets even weirder. 3 weeks after Chuck's death, Ruth Morgan was visited at her home by 2 men who claimed they were special agents with the FBI. She says they pulled out their identification and flashed it to her very quickly before telling her they were looking for something. They proceeded to search through the house and pretty much tore it apart. Ruth was so flustered by the situation that she didn't even think to ask for a search warrant or take down the agents' names. They never said what they were looking for, and the implication seemed to be that they never did find it. Anyway, since the police didn't seem to be putting much effort into investigating this case, Don Devereaux, the investigative journalist you heard at the beginning of this podcast, he got involved and started looking into Chuck's death. By now, you might be thinking this whole thing is somehow connected to illegal activity at Chuck's escrow company, and you'd definitely be right. If Chuck was telling the truth about the Mafia putting out a contract on his life, then it's easy to piece together how he could have gotten mixed up with them. Mafia activity was very prominent in Arizona during the 1970s, as it was the ideal location to establish a pipeline for smuggling narcotics into Mexico. Arizona also had a state law which allowed anyone to buy up land through numbered blind trust accounts, and as you can imagine, people took advantage of this for the purposes of money laundering. It turned out that Chuck had done real estate escrow work for at least one Mafia family, and it's possible they also used him to help with the purchase of gold bullion and platinum, which would have been a very convenient way to launder money. After searching through Chuck's records, Devereaux concluded that he probably started working with the Mafia back in 1973, and over the course of the next few years was doing over $1 billion in escrow work in gold bullion and platinum. Ruth claimed that Chuck did mention at one point that there was money laundering going on in Tucson. He denied he was personally involved in it, but added, "The less the girls and you know, the better." In fact, around the time of Chuck's first disappearance in March of 1977, he was being used as a potential witness in a state land fraud case against an organized crime boss. He gave state investigators a sworn deposition, but turned down their offer for protection. So the big question here is, did Chuck get involved in illegal activity for his own personal gain? Or was he actually helping the government fight organized crime? Remember, he hinted to his wife that he had secretly been working for the Treasury Department. After Chuck's death, the FBI did open an investigation into his case, and even interviewed his attorney at one point, though it doesn't look like their investigation went very far. Well, years later, Don Devereaux made a Freedom of Information Act request to the FBI, but they claimed they never even heard of Chuck Morgan and had no information about him whatsoever. They didn't even have any record of 2 FBI agents visiting Ruth Morgan's home. So there was obviously something really suspicious going on here. Well, Devereaux would not let this case die, and it eventually wound up at the hands of Unsolved Mysteries, who aired a segment about Chuck Morgan's death in February of 1990. During the segment, a lieutenant from the Pima County Sheriff's Department was interviewed and claimed that in spite of the suicide ruling, some officers from that department told him they did believe Chuck's death was a homicide. However, he said that all of these same people eventually left law enforcement because they were in fear for their lives, and apparently at least 2 of them went so far as to leave the U.S. So after the broadcast, the phone lines at the Unsolved Mysteries telecenter just lit up, and they wound up receiving over 600 calls. In fact, the Morgan case got more viewer tips than any other segment in the show's history up until that point. Devereaux personally investigated all the leads which developed from this, and made some pretty shocking discoveries. It turns out that a large chunk of the billions of dollars in gold bullion which Chuck purchased, it originated from Southeast Asia at the end of the Vietnam War. Apparently, there were a lot of people involved in this operation, including members of the U.S. intelligence community from the CIA and the Department of Defense. Hell, even some officials from the Vietnamese government forced to go into exile after the war were involved. It seemed like the whole thing went far beyond just money laundering for the mafia. One other lead Devereaux investigated was a money laundering scheme which took place during the 1970s involving real estate from Willcox, Arizona. Chuck Morgan was alleged to be involved in this scheme alongside a friend of his, a Willcox real estate agent named Jack Tillman. Morgan and Tillman apparently met up during the 11-day period he was hiding, and this is where Chuck possibly learned about the contract on his life. Morgan's death seemed to shake Tillman up in a big way, so he terminated his real estate dealings before he left the area and died of cancer in 1981. Devereaux also learned that Morgan kept a duplicate set of records for all his illicit transactions, including the Willcox real estate scheme. Chuck apparently believed that these records would act as his insurance policy in case his life was ever in danger. Anyway, in spite of all these new leads and discoveries, the case continued to remain unsolved, but shockingly, another mysterious death would take place just 3 months after the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired. On the evening of May 14, 1990, a 35-year-old Phoenix resident named Doug Johnston was found murdered in the driver's seat of his car. Johnston was a computer draftsman and had left his home at 11 p.m. to go work an overnight shift at his computer graphics company. Shortly after he arrived in the company's parking lot, he was shot at close range behind his left ear. For reasons I cannot fathom, the police initially looked at Johnston's death as a suicide. There were several problems with this. No gunpowder residue was found on Johnston's hands. He was right-handed, which would have made it very difficult to shoot himself behind the left ear. And, there was no gun found at the scene. That's stellar police work there. Now, to be fair, the medical examiner's logic was that there was no direct evidence to point towards it being murder or suicide, which is why his ruling for the death was undetermined. But come on! The only way it could be suicide is if Johnston shot himself and some random person just happened upon the scene and decided to steal the gun before the police arrived. But I'd say there's pretty much zero chance that that happened. However, it's true that there was a perplexing lack of motive for murder in this case. By all accounts, Doug was a happily married man with a 10-year-old daughter, and he was just starting out a brand new career in a new field. He didn't seem to have any enemies or skeletons in his closet. And all of his valuables, including his wallet, watch, and ring, were left behind at the scene, so robbery was definitely not the motive either. The murder seemed completely random, and the crime scene bore all the hallmarks of a professional hit. But why would anyone want to target this guy? Well, guess who lived directly across the street from the computer graphics company's parking lot? Don Devereaux. You might already have an idea where this is going, but I'm going to take a brief moment to talk about another case. About a year after Johnston's death, Devereaux was contacted by another investigative journalist from Washington, D.C. named Danny Casolaro, who asked Devereaux to send him all the information he had uncovered about Chuck Morgan's illegal transactions involving gold bullion. Devereaux was about to do so, but on August 10, 1991, Casolaro was found dead in the bathtub of his hotel room in Martinsburg, West Virginia. His wrist had been slashed a dozen times, and the official ruling was suicide, but there were a lot of suspicious things surrounding Casolaro's death which made people suspect he was murdered, because he had uncovered too much incriminating information about government corruption. The Casolaro case was also featured on Unsolved Mysteries, but that story is such a huge rabbit hole that I'm not going to go into any more details here. I might do a separate podcast episode about Danny Casolaro's death sometime in the future, but in the meantime, feel free to do your own research into his case, which has been classified as the octopus. But I brought it up because the deaths of Chuck Morgan, Doug Johnston, and Danny Casolaro might be the only example of 3 separate unsolved mysteries cases being interlocked together, and it's entirely possible that all 3 victims were murdered by the same network of people. That should give you an idea about what a bizarre and convoluted story this is. Anyway, 6 months after Casolaro's death, Devereaux conversed with another journalist who had received some shocking news from a contact within the CIA. Apparently, after the Unsolved Mysteries segment aired about Chuck Morgan's case, and Devereaux started digging deeper into links between the CIA and organized crime, a contract was put out on his life. I just mentioned how Devereaux lived directly across the street from the parking lot where Doug Johnston was killed, but here's the real unsettling part. At the time, both Devereaux and Johnston drove very similar-looking 1970s model Toyota station wagons. Since the computer graphics company and Devereaux's residence were directly opposite of one another, there was only a 1-digit difference in their addresses. In fact, because of this, Devereaux claimed that mail addressed to the company was often delivered to him by mistake. So yes, the implication seems to be that someone who was contracted to murder Don Devereaux might have accidentally hit the wrong person, and Doug Johnston might have been a completely innocent victim of mistaken identity. On a dark night, it would have been very easy for a hitman to go to the wrong address, see Johnston's car pull into the parking lot, and walk up and shoot him from behind without even realizing that they murdered the wrong person. Devereaux also learned from his colleague that there were still open contracts out on his life, and 2 of his other sources, one from the CIA and the other from Israeli intelligence, they confirmed this. So Devereaux immediately went back to Unsolved Mysteries, and the show aired a segment about Doug Johnston's death in May of 1992. Well, you'll be happy to know that these alleged contracts on Devereaux's life were never carried out, and he's still alive today. In fact, in spite of the fact that he's in his 80s now, he still seems to be working as an investigative journalist and maintains his own website at dondevereaux.com, which he is devoted to investigating some other suspicious deaths. However, in spite of the exposure both cases got on Unsolved Mysteries, no one has ever uncovered who was responsible for the deaths of Chuck Morgan or Doug Johnston. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. So yeah, I'm not one who automatically shouts conspiracy theory every time there's a mysterious death, but there's definitely something shady going on in this story. I'll start with talking about Doug Johnston because I think it's pretty cut and dried what happened there. There's 0 chance he committed suicide, and I don't know what the hell the cops were thinking when they even considered that as an option. I do believe that Johnston was the victim of a botched contract hit intended for Don Devereaux because there's really no other logical explanation to account for what happened to him. If Johnston had been robbed, or there was any indication that the guy had dark secrets, then I'd be willing to consider other possibilities, but there's just nothing in this guy's background which would make him a target for murder. Barring the slim possibility that some psycho just decided to shoot Johnston at random for the hell of it, he was clearly the unfortunate victim of mistaken identity. Other than the Unsolved Mysteries segment, there seems to be 0 information out there on the internet about the Johnston murder. Unfortunately, the investigators had no evidence to work with, so whoever killed Johnston essentially got away with a perfect crime. Well, aside from the fact that they probably murdered the wrong person. But if you're wondering why Don Devereaux is still alive after all these years, if there were contracts out on his life, it's probably because whoever ordered the hit thought there would be too much unwanted attention if Devereaux suddenly wound up dead right after the Johnston murder. By appearing on Unsolved Mysteries and putting himself in the spotlight, Devereaux probably saved his own life, because if he was murdered after garnering all this attention, there would be a lot more questions asked. Since Devereaux never did obtain enough information to unravel this alleged conspiracy, they probably decided that killing him was no longer necessary. But while Doug Johnston's death is a clear-cut case of murder, Chuck Morgan's story is a lot more complex, and there are so many layers of weirdness here. There isn't a whole lot of information about Morgan's death available on the internet either, but the odd article about it does get published every now and then. The Arizona Daily Star did a story about it in March of 2010, and even though it mentioned that Ruth Morgan passed away in 2006, their daughters are still trying to uncover the truth about Chuck's death. They believe that in addition to his potential connections to organized crime and the federal government, Chuck may have also had potentially damaging information about prominent politicians. Anyway, let's at least examine the possibility that Chuck really did commit suicide, because it isn't 100% impossible. Even though there were plenty of suspicious inconsistencies at the crime scene, there are documented cases of people who've taken steps to make their suicide look as bizarre as possible in order to make everyone believe they were murdered. A recent example of this is the 2009 death of a man named Bill Sparkman, who was suffering from cancer and decided to stage an elaborate suicide which gave off the impression he'd been murdered. This way, Sparkman's family could collect on a substantial life insurance policy, which would be null and void if he killed himself. Sparkman went all out by stripping naked, tying himself to a tree, gagging himself, and writing a word on his chest. But in the end, after a thorough examination of the evidence, the police saw through the whole thing and ruled Sparkman's death to be a suicide. So would Chuck Morgan have done something similar? The thing with Chuck's case is that he made a lot of wild claims, but there isn't much verifiable evidence to support them. He disappeared for 3 days and said he was kidnapped, but he never notified the police, and technically, we only have Chuck's word that this abduction happened. He told his father about a letter which would explain his whole story should anything ever happen to him, but something did happen to him, and the letter never surfaced. Chuck also claimed he was doing secret undercover work for the government, but there doesn't seem to be any official record of that either. I actually envisioned a scenario where Chuck was involved in illegal activity, got in way over his head, and figured he was going to be caught eventually. So he orchestrates all these strange events to give off the impression that his life is in danger because he's working this undercover assignment for the government. He then stages his suicide to look like a murder so that everyone will think that he died a heroic death serving his country. In his eyes, it's a much better way to go rather than getting arrested for his illegal activities and going to prison. Some of the strange details at the crime scene could have conceivably been fabricated by Chuck. I always wondered why investigators placed so much significance on the sunglasses found in Chuck's car and how they didn't belong to him. Even if Chuck's family claimed that he didn't own a pair of sunglasses like that, who's to say that he didn't buy them somewhere during his 11-day period he was missing? As crazy as it sounds, maybe Chuck went to the trouble of extracting one of his teeth and wrapping it in a handkerchief in order to make people think he'd been roughed up. Maybe all the cryptic stuff written on the $2 bill was nonsense, intended to throw everybody off the track. And hell, even though he was right-handed, Chuck could have made the calculated decision to shoot himself with his left hand in order to confuse everyone. It's even possible that Chuck's life wasn't really in any danger, but he just became super paranoid and had a complete mental breakdown before committing suicide. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to apply Occam's razor to this whole scenario, but I think the one piece of evidence which negates the suicide theory is the fact that no fingerprints were found on Chuck's .357 Magnum. You can do a lot of strange things to make your suicide look like a murder, but I don't see how you can wipe fingerprints off your own gun after you've shot yourself in the head. So in spite of the suicide ruling, I am pretty certain there was foul play involved here. But the question is, why? Well, let's start with Chuck's bizarre kidnapping episode, where he disappeared from his family for 3 days before returning. The whole thing is so strange, and is the main reason I was entertaining the possibility that Chuck fabricated the whole thing. But if it happened, I think the most logical scenario is that someone found out that Chuck had made duplicate records of their illicit transactions and kidnapped him to get their hands on them. They probably interrogated Chuck and kept him detained for nearly 3 days until the records were recovered and destroyed. It is strange that they would just let Chuck go after this, especially if his claim that they took his treasury identification is accurate. If they discovered he was doing secret undercover work for the government, you'd think that they'd kill him immediately, unless A, they still believed Chuck's escrow company was useful for their operation, so it was more logical to let him live, or B, Chuck completely lied to his wife about his affiliation with the government. Now, the hallucinogenic drug which was allegedly painted to Chuck's throat and would apparently drive him insane if he spoke, I don't know what to make of that. I do think it's possible that this was entirely a psychological thing. Maybe this so-called hallucinogenic drug didn't really kill people or drive them insane, but Chuck's captors told them that it did when they gave it to him. Chuck wouldn't have known any better, and probably didn't want to take any chances, so he just stayed silent for the next week. But if that drug was legitimate, then this lends credence to the theory that this money laundering operation extended far beyond the mafia into branches of the government such as the CIA. I don't think weird hallucinogenic drugs are part of the mafia's MO, but they're right up the CIA's alley. So if this whole kidnapping episode was connected to Chuck's duplicate records, and his captors got a hold of these records, then his insurance policy was gone. I think they decided to let Chuck go and let him live for a while, because they still thought he might be useful, but they ultimately decided he was a liability, and put a contract out on him. Chuck obviously sensed his days were numbered, which is why he always wore a bulletproof vest, and was super protective of his children. Once word got out, and Chuck learned about the contract, he disappeared again, and went into hiding, so he could figure out what to do. Now there's the matter of the mysterious female caller, Green Eyes. As I'm sure you probably guessed, she's never been identified. One of the newspaper articles about this case said that during her phone call to the police, the woman claimed she'd been seeing Chuck socially, but I'm not exactly sure what this means. Were she and Chuck having an affair? Did she have some sort of connection to the money laundering operation, or the mysterious people Chuck was working for? If Chuck was willing to share all this information about his ordeal with her, and show her $60,000 in cash, then he obviously trusted her. I do wonder if it was Chuck who asked Green Eyes to call his wife, and assure her he was alright, and also mention the Bible passage, Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8. So I guess this would be an appropriate time to move on to Chuck's cryptic $2 bill, which is undoubtedly the weirdest aspect of this case. If you look up Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8, the last verse reads, "Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, everything is meaningless." Many biblical scholars have interpreted this passage as being an allegory for old age, and on the surface, it sounds like the type of passage a person would cite if he was planning to commit suicide and had lost all hope. But if you don't believe it was suicide, then reading the entire passage doesn't provide much insight into Chuck's situation. For all we know, all the stuff on the $2 bill might be nothing more than gibberish written by a mentally unstable man, but it does seem likely that there's some sort of coded message there. Now, I am the last person who knows anything about cryptography or deciphering coded messages. Chuck was apparently a Mason, so one theory is that some of the annotations have Masonic implications, but I couldn't tell you. I have no idea what the significance could be for Ecclesiastes 12, 1-8, or those Spanish surnames listed alphabetically A through G, or the numbers written on the signers of the Declaration of Independence. This is pretty much a real-world example of something you might find in a Dan Brown novel. If Chuck really was doing secret work for the government, this may have been his attempt to pass them coded messages. However, the theory put forth by Don Devereaux is that Chuck probably had another important document stashed out there somewhere, and that the $2 bill was required to unlock a secret message on this document. You would need to combine the document and the $2 bill together in order to make sense out of the whole thing. But if this document actually existed, no one knows what happened to it. But if this theory is correct, then that might explain the visit by the two men who tore apart Ruth Morgan's home. Whether they actually worked for the FBI or not, these men might have been searching for the document required to break the code on the $2 bill. However, another possibility is that these men were searching for the alleged letter Chuck told his father about, which supposedly explained everything. If this letter contained incriminating information, then it would definitely be in someone's best interest to find it. So if Green Eyes' claim is true that Chuck showed her $60,000 in cash, which he was planning to use to buy himself out of a contract on his life, then in a twisted way, he may have actually paid for his own death. Don Devereaux's theory is that Chuck went to a meeting in the desert to pay off a hitman who had a contract to kill him, but the hitman double-crossed Chuck by taking his money and killing him anyway, so the strategy technically earned the killer an extra $60,000 bonus. I think that's a pretty logical theory, but the big question is whether or not Chuck actually did secret undercover work for the government. Like I mentioned earlier, it's possible he could have made that part up so his family wouldn't think he was involved in illegal activity. But the fact that the FBI investigated this case at first, and then acted like they never heard of Chuck Morgan years later, this leads me to believe they were hiding something, and that Chuck was affiliated with them somehow. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Chuck just approached the government out of the goodness of his heart and offered to help them fight organized crime. It's possible Chuck started off by doing a little money laundering to make himself some extra cash. He probably just figured he was doing some work for the mafia, and never envisioned that this operation would involve government agencies like the CIA. He eventually got himself in over his head, and either approached or was accosted by the FBI, the Treasury Department, or some other government agency, who gave him an ultimatum: do undercover work for us, or go to prison. Sadly, if Chuck was working as an informant for the government, they probably did a sloppy job at protecting him and ensuring his safety, which is why he eventually found himself in an impossible situation where his life was in danger. That might explain why he just seemed to go into hiding on his own during the 11 days preceding his death. I think the reason the FBI is unwilling to share anything about this case is because it would reveal that they did a lousy job of protecting an informant, or that there were major leaks in their organization which blew Chuck's cover. Investigating Chuck Morgan's death would probably open up a huge can of worms exposing massive corruption within the government, so you can see why the FBI would prefer to leave it alone. Sadly, it seems that in the long run, this episode indirectly led to the death of Doug Johnston, a completely innocent man who had nothing to do with this whole thing. Unfortunately, I think so much time has passed that I'm not sure we'll ever know who was responsible for the murders of Chuck Morgan or Doug Johnston. But I know that the families of both victims will not stop searching for justice. And since Don Devereaux is still alive and well and continuing to work as an investigative journalist, it's not impossible that he might uncover the full truth someday. But I have a feeling that if we went all the way down the rabbit hole and found out what happened, we'd probably learn some pretty shocking things. So that's about it for this episode. If you have any information about the deaths of Chuck Morgan or Doug Johnston, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you have your own theories, I'd love to hear from you. Hell, if you think you can decipher the coded message on Chuck Morgan's $2 bill, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email. You can find an image of the $2 bill on the Unsolved Mysteries website. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email me at robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. I want to thank all my loyal listeners and supporters out there, especially those from the aforementioned Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. A big thank you to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and is the managing editor of The Back Row, the website which hosts this very podcast. And of course, a big shout out to Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, or Google Play Music. And like I mentioned earlier, we also have a donate button on our website. So if you're feeling generous and want to express your appreciation for all the hard work we put into this podcast, we'd be extremely grateful. You can also check out my true crime and mystery articles at crack.com and listverse.com, and there's plenty of other non-true crime content you can find right here at The Back Row. So have yourself a good week, and join me next time for a brand new minisode of The Trail Went Cold.